On my first Thanksgiving as a wife, my stepmom-in-law stood up at the end of the table, raised her wine glass, and announced that my $280,000 in savings officially belongs to her daughter now. The room went dead quiet. 16, maybe 20 people stared down the table at me like I was a number on a screen. "You do not even have kids," Carla said, smiling as if she were stating a simple fact. "You do not need that much just sitting there. Your $280,000 belongs to Tessa now. She needs a real start in life. If you love this family, you would help her." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. 7 years of careful work had just been put up for discussion, like another dish on the table. Mark, my husband, did not say no. He did not say it is Lily's money. He leaned back and added, "She is 29. She is a numbers girl. She will make it back. Tessa only gets one shot." He even laughed a little, as if that amount was something I could replace with a few extra hours at the office. No one asked whether Carla had the right to claim my future. They just waited to see if I would be generous enough to hand it over. Tessa tilted her head. "I already picked a place near Capitol Hill," she said. "Rent is crazy up there. I could really use that $280. She spoke like the money was already halfway in her account. I let my eyes move around the room instead of looking at her. The lights I hung, the art I paid for, the cabinet where our mortgage papers sat with my name on every page. They were sitting in a house I mostly paid for, and somehow I was the one being told I owed more. Carla set down her glass and reached for a folder on the sideboard. "We even made it simple," she said. "We put together a family agreement so everything is clear. You just sign here to transfer the funds to Tessa, and everyone can sign as witnesses." She pulled out printed pages. "Family Agreement," the title read. Mark took the papers and a pen. Without looking at me, he slid the stack across the table until it bumped my plate. "Come on, Lil," he said. "Do not make this weird. Sign it. Do not embarrass me in front of everyone." That was the part that hit hardest. Not just that he was willing to give away my savings, but that saying no would be treated as rude. They had turned my boundaries into bad manners. I looked at the three of them. Carla already picturing her daughter signing a lease. Tessa glowing. Mark jaw tight, waiting for me to give him the easy answer. "So my life savings are a group decision now?" I asked. My voice sounded steady. Carla's smile thinned. "Sometimes the family has to tell you what is best for you," she said. "You are young. You will make more." To her, that was all I was. Young, earning, replaceable. Under the table, my phone pressed against my leg. That afternoon, I had checked the account they were discussing, then swiped to another screen that showed everything I owned together. The number there was several times what anyone in this room imagined. They had no idea there were other accounts or that there was a quiet stake in a business paying me every year. They thought they were pushing me toward a cliff. They did not know there was solid ground behind me. In the corner of the dining room, a small black briefcase sat beside the console table, half hidden under a folded throw blanket. I had set it there before the guests arrived. No one had noticed it once. I reached out and gently pushed the stack of papers back across the table toward Carla. The room seemed to lean with them. "That account you're all fighting over," I said, keeping my eyes on her but aiming my words at Mark. "Maybe you should ask Mark what he already did with it." The silence that followed shifted. A moment ago, every eye had been on me. Now heads turned down the table toward my husband. His fingers tightened around the pen. Color drained from his face. Carla's smile vanished. "What is she talking about?" she asked him. Mark opened his mouth closed. It swallowed hard. For once he did not seem to have a ready answer. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and pushed my chair back. From the inside pocket of my jacket, hanging on the back of the chair, I pulled out a manila envelope stamped with the blue logo of our bank. I laid it on the table next to Carla's family agreement. "You wanted to talk about my money in front of everyone," I said. "Good. Because what is inside this envelope is going to make tonight a lot more interesting than you planned." I was 29, young enough for Carla to call me inexperienced, yet old enough to have built a life she never bothered to understand. And while they sat around that table acting as if my $280,000 had fallen from the sky, the truth was that every cent had come from years of precise discipline, long nights in front of data sets, and a quiet determination carved into me since the day I watched my father's casket lowered into the ground. A cold Oregon morning when I was 18 and still half child, still learning that money was not simply numbers, it was security dignity, a shield you earned inch by inch. After he died in that construction accident, I promised myself I would never be caught unprepared. Not financially, not emotionally, not ever again. So by 22, I was already working full-time while taking night classes, eating the same slow cooker meals for weeks, just to save a little extra. And the moment my first student loan statement arrived, I attacked it with a kind of obsession, because debt felt like a chain, and I refused to live chained. By 26, those loans were gone, cleared in full, and from that point forward, everything I earned went into the steady architecture of a future no one in Mark's family ever saw or cared to imagine. They thought of me as the quiet girl from Renton who worked at some bank in Seattle, but I was a senior data analyst in the fraud division of a regional institution that oversaw billions in assets, a department where precision meant everything, where you learn to track patterns, money trails, risk signals, and the subtle tells of people who lied without blinking. So when Carla casually assumed I would simply hand over my savings to her daughter, she had no idea she was speaking to someone who knew how to spot manipulation from the first syllable. My salary was solid high enough that HR reminded me every year about bonus tiers, and my stock options grew quietly in the background. Another line of stability I never bragged about, and I kept my life modest. No designer bags, no luxury trips, just careful budgeting and steady contributions to my 401 KIS, my Roth IRA, and a brokerage account where I kept liquid investments that slowly accumulated into the same $280,000 they were now claiming as community property. But even that did not tell the full story, because what Carla and Tessa and even Mark never bothered to ask was how I had managed to get ahead so fast, how a girl with no wealthy mother, no safety net, no glamorous pedigree could have built so much, so young. And the answer lived in a set of documents tucked into the bottom drawer of my desk. When my father died, he left me something that looked small on paper but turned into the spine of my financial life. 20% ownership in a chain of 3 hardware stores in Oregon, unassuming little shops with steady traffic, loyal local contractors, and margins that were not flashy but dependable. And every year those stores sent me dividends, $50,000 to $70,000, depending on seasonal sales money. I never spent, never advertised, and never once mentioned to Mark, because I learned early that the safest money is the money no one knows exists. That stake, combined with my investments, had grown into a net worth of around $1.2 million a number that would have sent Carla into a frenzy if she had ever glimpsed it, and I kept it hidden behind passwords and 2-factor authentication and the simple habit of silence. They only knew about the $280,000 because that was the part visible through the fog of everyday married finances, the shared discussions about bills and insurance, the occasional glimpse of a statement on my laptop, but the real foundation of my life remained invisible, and I intended to keep it that way. Mark was 34 older than me by enough years that his family liked to frame me as the lucky one, the girl who married up, yet his work history told a different story, a zigzag of short-term sales jobs at car dealerships, stretches of unemployment disguised as self-reflection and credit cards he never quite managed to pay on time. When we married, his credit score was so low he could barely qualify for a cell phone plan. And when we bought the townhouse in Renton, it was my income. The bank used my name on the primary application, my history, that secured the rate. I told myself it was normal for couples to share burdens to merge strengths, and I convinced myself that Mark trying was enough, even when trying meant late nights pacing around the kitchen because another job had fallen through. Carla adored him, though insisted he was hard-working, insisted he had potential, and every time she said it, she glanced at me as if I should be grateful to be part of her family's story. Tessa, her daughter, 23 and drifting from job to job and dropping out of community college twice, believed the world owed her comfort, simply because she wanted it, and Carla supported that belief with the kind of indulgence that creates adults who never grow into their responsibilities. They all sat at that Thanksgiving table, believing they had authority over me, believing they understood the balance of power, believing my youth made me easy to corner. But the truth was carved into a document I had signed 3 months earlier in a quiet office, while Mark was helping a friend move a refinance agreement that placed the townhouse in my name alone, removing him from the title entirely, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because his credit problems created risks I was not willing to take. He had signed the consent form without reading it carefully, eager to avoid questions about his debt, and that single moment shifted the entire foundation of our marriage, though neither he nor Carla ever realized it until much later. They thought they were the ones making the rules, but the house, the loan, the equity, the future, all of it rested on me. They believed I was just an ATM. They had no idea I was the one holding the deed. Long before the night they tried to claim my savings as community property dressed up as generosity, the smaller wounds had been carving their way into me, piece by piece, slow enough that I kept telling myself to be patient, to be understanding, to be the bigger person, because that was what a good wife did, or at least what I thought a good wife was supposed to do. So every family gathering became a test of how much I could absorb without flinching. Starting with the summer barbecue at Carla's house, where I spent most of the afternoon chopping vegetables in her overheated kitchen, while she hovered behind me with the expression of someone grading a student she expected to fail, muttering that my seasoning was bland and the grill marks were uneven and that a real wife would know how to balance flavors better. A comment she repeated loudly enough for Tessa to hear from the couch where she lay scrolling through her phone, her legs draped over a throw pillow and her only contribution a bored glance toward the food she had no intention of helping prepare. I had come straight from a full day at work, still in my office slacks, because I had not even stopped home to change. Yet somehow I was the one being measured and found lacking, and when we sat down to eat, the chorus of small remarks continued, subtle enough to mask as jokes, but sharp enough to leave marks, like when Carla lifted her fork, tasted the chicken, and sighed that it was fine but not memorable, then followed with a pointed, "You are good with numbers but not much with people, huh?" A line that earned a couple chuckles from the cousins and a faint smile from Mark, who looked embarrassed for a second, then decided it was safer to join the laughter. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself families teased. I told myself it was normal to be the outsider for a while, but the pattern did not drift away with time. It accumulated, growing heavier with each gathering, like the dinner at a seafood restaurant where Carla waited until the bill arrived, then placed her menu neatly on the table and announced that since Lily makes the most, it is only fair she cover it. And when every head turned to me with the expectant entitlement of people used to others picking up the check, Mark simply shrugged and said, "You know, you have got it," as if my income were a communal well, and draining it was a family bonding exercise. I paid that night because the awkwardness of refusing felt worse than the sting of being used, and I walked to the car afterward with a knot in my throat, thinking that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe this was just a rough patch, that maybe generosity would eventually come back to me if I kept giving without keeping score. But the ledger in my heart kept registering every dig and every demand, and every moment someone hinted that my value was tied directly to my wallet. The comments about children cut deepest because they came wrapped in faux concern. Women at the table asking when I would finally give Mark a baby, asking why I spent so much time climbing the career ladder when a man wanted partnership, not competition, asking what the point of all that money was if I had no one to pass it, to lines delivered as if they were wisdom instead of narrow judgments. And every time I opened my mouth to answer, Carla jumped in, saying Tessa is more of a family person. Tessa has her priorities straight. Tessa would make a wonderful mother. I began noticing that no matter what I did or how kindly I tried to blend in, they had already assigned me a role. The girl who earned the girl, who paid the girl who worked too much. The girl whose savings were a resource for everyone but her. And for a long time, I swallowed it because I wanted to believe marriage meant compromise, that family meant folding yourself gently around the people your partner came from, even when they poked and prodded at the edges of your patience. I kept thinking I thought this was what marriage meant: compromise, family, being kind. And each time I told myself that I pushed my own discomfort a little further aside. I remember cleaning the patio after another barbecue while conversations drifted inside the house, Mark laughing with his uncles as if we were not already stretched thin financially. And I kept wiping the same patch of table because something inside me felt unsettled, a quiet whisper saying that kindness should not always flow in one direction. But I kept pushing that thought down, telling myself not to be difficult, not to be dramatic, not to be ungrateful. The moment that broke the illusion did not come with shouting or confrontation. It came on an ordinary evening when I arrived at Carla's house early to help prepare dinner, stepping through the back door into the kitchen and hearing her voice before she saw me. Her tone sharp and dismissive as she spoke to a neighbor leaning against the counter, saying that girl is not family. She's just a walking wallet for my daughter's future. And the words landed with such clarity that the air seemed to thicken around me. I froze in the doorway, fingers tightening on the grocery bag I was holding. My breath catching in my throat as the meaning settled, because for the first time I heard out loud what I had been trying so hard not to admit, that in their eyes, I was not a daughter-in-law, not a partner in their circle, not someone they welcomed, but a resource to be extracted, a solution to their financial fantasies, a convenient bank account with a polite face and a steady income. Carla kept talking, explaining that Tessa needed a boost and that I had more money than I knew what to do with, laughing softly in a way that made it clear she felt entitled to plans that involved my work, my savings, my future. I stepped back quietly so she would not know I heard her, but the damage had already been done, the final confirmation that every slight and every expectation had been building towards something larger. And as I stood in that hallway listening to them talk about me as if I were for sale, I felt something shift inside me, something steady and cold and certain. It was the first time I realized I was not part of their family, not in any way that mattered to them. And that understanding became the quiet hinge on which everything else would turn. The moment I realized the comments and the entitlement were only the surface of something far darker, came quietly, not with a shout or a dramatic discovery, but with a line item on our joint account that did not make sense, a $5,000 withdrawal on a Wednesday morning when I was already at work in Seattle, running through data sets and forecasting risk models. And for a moment, I stared at the notification on my phone, thinking it was a glitch, because I knew exactly how much went in and out of that account every week. Yet when I asked Mark about it, that evening, he barely looked up from the game on his phone and said emergency for Tessa, as if emergencies were routine for a 23-year-old who'd been drifting between part-time jobs and half-finished classes. And I remember feeling uncomfortable, but not yet suspicious, telling myself that maybe someone really was sick, or maybe a bill came up. And I let it go, even though the explanation was as thin as the patience I was slowly losing. A week later, another withdrawal appeared, $7,500 this time, and when I asked, he said medical bill, spoken with the same careless tone of someone who had decided I would not question him because I usually did not. And I remember standing in the kitchen with dishes in my hand, wondering why a medical bill would be paid from our joint account instead of a family member's insurance, wondering why the amount was so oddly rounded, wondering why he seemed annoyed that I even asked. But again, I pushed the questions down because I was still in the stage where I assumed good intent even when the evidence was beginning to tilt against it. Then came the $3,200, another unannounced hit, and this time, Mark sighed dramatically, rubbed his face, and said, "Tessa's car broke down. She needed help." You know how hard things have been for her, and something in me flickered, because every story seemed to orbit the same person, the same needs, the same bottomless pit, and none of the money ever came back, not a dollar, not a promise. Not even a mention of repayment, because in their world, my earnings were the family safety net, and I was expected to contribute without question. I started making an Excel sheet late at night while Mark slept, listing the dates, amounts, excuses, and the growing pattern made my stomach tighten, because the emotional undulation came in waves, shock when I noticed the withdrawals, doubt when he brushed them off hurt, when I understood he felt entitled to my work, a hardening when the pattern repeated, and then clarity as I slowly realized that love did not erase accountability, and marriage did not justify misuse. I thought that was the peak of it until one afternoon during my lunch break when I opened my inbox and saw an email from a dealership with a subject line congratulating us on the down payment for a new vehicle. And I remember feeling the world narrow to a pinpoint as I clicked the message and saw the number $16,000 paid from our joint account, authorized by Mark, and the name on the buyer's line was not mine. It was Tessa's, and the ground inside me tilted because this was not a loan, not a medical emergency, not a bill. It was a luxury for someone who had contributed nothing yet expected everything. I drove home that evening with my pulse steady in a way I did not expect, a steadiness that comes when shock has burned off and something colder has taken its place. And I asked Mark calmly about the down payment, watching his face twitch, before he exploded in the living room with Carla and Tessa sitting right there shouting that it is our money, and I needed to stop acting like it was just mine. A line that stunned me. Not because he said it, but because Carla nodded in agreement as if the logic were flawless, telling me you do not get to call it stolen when it is still in the family, twisting the definition of theft into something convenient for them rewriting boundaries mid-sentence to justify anything they wanted from me. I stood there realizing I was surrounded by people who had never once viewed my earnings as personal or my savings as hard-earned security. They saw me as the walking wallet Carla had described behind my back, the reliable funder of their choices, the person they believed would always refill the pot while they drained it without guilt. That was the moment the emotional undulation reached the stage of awakening a deep internal shift where denial dissolves and truth stands alone, because the story had changed from unkind comments to calculated financial abuse. And the woman I had been the one who explained away too much and excused too often began to give way to someone sharper, someone listening, someone ready to take notes, gather evidence, protect herself, and reclaim what had been siphoned from her in the name of family. I did not become someone different overnight. The shift began quietly, the way a tide pulls back before a storm subtle enough that no one in that house noticed. Not Mark with his careless spending, not Carla with her greedy calculations, not Tessa with her casual entitlement, because on the outside I still moved through the routines of our life, still cooked dinner, still went to work, still answered questions with calm civility. Yet inside, something had clicked into place the moment I saw that $16,000 down payment, a point of no return, where I realized that enduring would only invite more taking, and that if I wanted this bleeding to stop, I would have to be the one to close the wound. The first step felt almost too simple. Opening a new account at a credit union in Renton that used my maiden name, Cross, a name no one on Mark's side ever used or paid attention to. And I remember sitting across from the teller, nodding politely as she explained terms and benefits, while inside I was already imagining the distance this would create, a hidden room in my life where Mark had no key. Then I walked out into the cold evening with a quiet sense of purpose, knowing exactly what I needed to do next. I redirected my salary to the new account, a process that took less than 10 minutes, but felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. And over the next 2 weeks, I reduced the joint account balance slowly until it held only enough to cover the fixed monthly bills, watching the numbers shrink from what had once been a financial well for Mark's impulsive generosity toward Tessa into a tightly controlled stream he could no longer divert without consequences. And while I adjusted the flow of money, I also secured the gates, changing every online banking password, updating security questions, shifting two-factor authentication to an email account Mark had never seen. Not because he had asked for access, he never needed to. He simply acted as if access was implied by marriage, but because I had finally accepted that trust without boundaries was an invitation to be robbed. Around this time, I arranged a quiet meeting with a man named Harold, a longtime customer at the bank and an attorney specializing in family law, someone who had once told me in passing that people rarely understand how common financial abuse is inside marriages until they experience it themselves. And when I sat across from him in a small downtown coffee shop, describing the unexplained withdrawals and the way Mark responded with entitlement instead of remorse, he listened carefully, then gave me practical advice delivered in a calm, steady voice that made everything sound almost procedural, telling me to save every statement, every text, every email, every voicemail, to screenshot balances before and after transactions, to record conversations when possible, because documentation was my shield, and if the situation escalated, I would need every line of proof. I walked out of that meeting with a notebook full of steps and a mind that felt sharper than it had in months, because for the first time I was not reacting, I was planning. And the difference between those two states felt like the difference between drowning and swimming. Then on a Thursday evening just after 9, while I was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning up a spreadsheet from work, an email appeared with the subject line, "Your home equity line of credit has been approved," and I froze because I had never applied for a HELOC. I had never even discussed one. And when I clicked the message and saw the amount, $100,000, my heart began beating in a slow, heavy rhythm that felt almost too controlled, the kind of calm that rises not from peace, but from recognition of danger. And I knew immediately that this was not a mistake. This was intentional. The document attached showed the address of our townhouse, my full legal name, and an approval signature that read, Lily Cross, a version of my name I recognized, but in handwriting I did not, a looping, exaggerated script I had never used. And as I studied the signature, I felt that cold, tightening sensation of betrayal deepen into something sharper, because this was no longer someone using me. This was someone impersonating me, someone leveraging my credit, my home, my identity for their own gain, and every instinct told me exactly who had done it. I printed the entire packet and laid the pages out across the dining table, examining each section as if it were a crime scene, and in a way it was a theft carried out in broad daylight on paper. And the more I read, the more horrifying the details became, because not only had the application been submitted without my knowledge, there were email traces indicating that Mark had communicated with the loan officer using my information, and tucked into the final pages was a note requesting expedited processing signed with that same forged version of my name. The next afternoon when I referenced the email thread with the timeline of Mark's recent conversations and the fact that Carla had been suspiciously interested in our home equity. A few weeks earlier, the truth snapped together like puzzle pieces locking into place. Mark had forged my signature, and Carla had coached him on how to do it. The woman who called me a walking wallet had now tried to use my identity as collateral for a 6-figure loan, and the weight of that realization settled into my chest like a stone. This was not drama. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not an argument about priorities. It was criminal. And in that moment, the last remnants of guilt I had been holding on to evaporated, replaced by a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be driven by emotion but by strategy. Because if they wanted to treat my life as a resource to plunder, then they would learn what it felt like when the person they underestimated stopped absorbing and started calculating. I woke the next morning with the forged signature still burned into my mind, the looping imitation of my handwriting sitting at the center of my thoughts like a warning flare. And as I drove toward the office in downtown Seattle, the gray November sky mirrored the heaviness in my chest. Yet beneath that weight, something sharper moved with purpose. Because unlike Mark and Carla, I understood exactly what a forged signature on a loan meant, not just emotionally, but legally, financially, structurally, in ways they had never bothered to imagine, since in their world, money simply appeared when someone else earned it. While in mine, money came with systems that documented everything and people whose entire jobs were to notice when a single number looked out of place. I walked into the bank where I worked, the quiet hum of the fraud analytics department, greeting me like a reminder that I spent my days dissecting the behavior of people exactly like the ones who had crossed me. People who thought they were clever enough to cheat signatures or slip paperwork through unnoticed people who underestimated the mechanisms tracking them. And as I logged into my workstation with its dual monitors and endless rows of suspicious patterns, I felt a strange and steady clarity, the kind that comes when you realize you are standing on home turf while your opponents are stumbling in the dark. I thought about the investigators I had worked with over the years, the internal fraud officer named Daniel who trusted my analysis more than most, the contact in the Washington Attorney General's office who had attended our trainings on financial misconduct, the networks of compliance auditors and risk evaluators whose entire existence revolved around stopping the kind of behavior Mark and Carla had pulled. And for the first time, I understood that my silence, the quiet way I lived, the modest way I dressed, had made them believe I had no power when in reality, my power simply did not announce itself with noise. At lunch, I walked across the Sky Bridge to the adjacent building where the fraud unit accepted internal referrals, carrying a manila folder with the forged HELOC documents printed cleanly. And I waited until I reached Daniel's desk before placing the file down with the same calmness I used when submitting an anonymous tip, telling him that I found a case with potential signature inconsistencies and unusual approval speed, asking if he could flag it for internal review because the pattern in the paperwork felt off. And he nodded without suspicion, marking the case and entering it directly into the system, initiating a process that would unfold through multiple departments, each one examining the signatures, timestamps, IP logs, and approval chain, building a digital trail that could not be undone by excuses or family pressure. Back at my desk, I kept working as if nothing had shifted. Yet under the surface, I could feel the machinery beginning to turn. And later that afternoon, when I met with the attorney I had contacted the night before, sitting in a quiet office overlooking Elliott Bay, I laid out the timeline with the precision of someone who had been documenting everything. And he listened without interrupting, his brow tightening, as I described the unauthorized withdrawals, the forged HELOC, and the manipulation wrapped in the language of family obligation. When he finally spoke, he did not soften the truth, explaining that forging a spouse's signature to obtain a loan using marital property was not a misunderstanding, but a potential felony, that falsifying financial documents and using someone's identity to secure credit fell under fraud statutes that Washington state took extremely seriously, and that if the bank pursued charges, both Mark and Carla could face consequences ranging from civil liability to criminal investigation, depending on how far the evidence pointed. He told me I had options, that I could legally dispute the loan request, immediate reversal, remove my liability entirely, and even report the fraud formally. And as I sat there absorbing each possibility, I felt no satisfaction, only confirmation of what I already sensed, that what they had done was not just morally wrong, but structurally dangerous. When I returned to the office the next day, Daniel pulled me aside, lowering his voice as he explained that my flagged case had already caused a stir. because the system showed something odd in approval pathway that bypassed standard steps and notes from months earlier indicating that someone named Carla had previously attempted to apply for a PPP loan under Carla's wellness boutique with documentation that did not fully add up, flagged for possible misrepresentation during the COVID surge, but never fully pursued because so many cases flooded the system at the time. Hearing her name in that context felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place, revealing a pattern not of desperation but of habit. A person comfortable bending rules, manipulating paperwork gaming systems the way she gamed people. And in that moment, I realized she did not just exploit me. Because I was convenient, she exploited anything that felt accessible and unguarded. Whether it was government funds, bank loans, or the daughter-in-law, she never accepted. Standing there while Daniel explained the red flags attached to her old application made something inside me settle, because I finally understood that confronting them was not just about reclaiming what they tried to steal from me. It was about stopping people who believed the world owed them whatever they could grab. And as I walked back to my desk through the quiet hum of the office, I felt the power of where I stood. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply rooted in a system designed to expose the very kind of deception they had built their confidence on. And for the first time in months, I felt the balance shift the ground, tilting not toward chaos, but toward justice, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. The day before Thanksgiving carried a strange stillness in the air, the kind that feels like a breath being held before a storm breaks. And as I drove home from the bank with the knowledge of Carla's previous suspicious loan attempt and the active investigation now unfolding behind the scenes, I felt an eerie calm settle into me. Not the fragile calm of someone trying to avoid conflict, but the composed, steady calm of someone who finally sees the terrain clearly and knows where each step will lead. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was already glowing with warm lights, laughter drifting through the open downstairs windows in a way that might have comforted me months earlier, but now only sharpened the contrast between the facade of family unity and the reality of what they were planning. And I walked inside quietly, hanging my coat in the hallway without drawing attention, because no one noticed me anyway, unless I was providing something, paying for something, solving something, and tonight I needed them to keep underestimating me for just a little longer. They were gathered on the main floor, voices overlapping in the easy rhythm of people, comfortable making decisions about someone who was not in the room. And I told Mark I needed to finish some work upstairs slipping out before he could ask anything. Not that he would ask, because as long as I was not interfering with whatever vision he and Carla had designed for Thanksgiving, he was content to let me disappear into the background. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, listening to the muffled sounds below, then decided to go downstairs to refill my water bottle, moving quietly down the carpeted steps until halfway down I heard Carla's voice rise above the others, sharp and confident, carrying the tone of someone giving instructions rather than sharing thoughts, and I stopped standing where the staircase curved so I could listen without being seen. Carla said tomorrow in front of everyone we will make it clear that the money goes to Tessa, the sentence landing with an air of finality as if she were announcing a schedule rather than dictating how my savings would be disbursed. And someone, probably one of the aunts, murmured approval, while another laughed softly as though this were an amusing form of charity rather than a planned ambush. Carla continued, "If she refuses, everyone will see who she really is," and I felt my fingers tighten around the railing, not from fear, but from the clarity of hearing the intent spoken so plainly, because there was no attempt to disguise it as kindness or concern. It was strategy, embarrassment, as leverage, shame, as a tool, and the confidence in her voice made it clear she expected me to crumble under public expectation, to fold the way they had seen me fold under smaller pressures. Then she said we will shame her into it, and the room responded with a chorus of approval, soft chuckles and satisfied hums, from people who believed morality was something they could manufacture to justify theft if enough relatives nodded along. Mark's voice joined in casual and certain, saying, "She is easier to control when people are watching," a sentence so cold and so revealing that I felt something inside me shift permanently, because it was the moment I understood that he did not just take from me through carelessness or weakness. He took because he believed control was his right, because he believed kindness made me pliable, because he believed the presence of others made me smaller. And hearing that from the man who had promised partnership felt like breaking glass inside my chest. Tessa chimed in as if the decision had already been finalized, talking about an apartment near Seattle she wanted, mentioning rent prices and decor ideas, speaking with the bright excitement of someone planning a shopping spree with money already in her pocket, and every detail she shared was another confirmation that in their minds, my savings were no longer mine. They were already part of her future. Her comfort, her lifestyle, and listening to her made me understand that even if I had agreed to help, once they would have come back again and again until I had nothing left. I stood there for several minutes, letting the truth of their words settle into my bones, then climbed the stairs, slowly feeling neither fear nor sadness, only an expanding clarity, a quiet tightening of resolve. The sense that tomorrow was not an ambush waiting to crush me. It was a stage they had built, without realizing I had prepared something far more precise in return. When I reached the bedroom, I closed the door softly, walked to the mirror above the dresser, and looked at my reflection without flinching, seeing not the woman they described downstairs, the one who could be controlled or shamed or manipulated, but the woman who had documented every unauthorized withdrawal, who understood the weight of forged signatures, who worked inside the very institution they had tried to deceive. And I whispered, tomorrow everybody is watching good, because for once being watched would not weaken me, it would expose them. I knelt beside the bed and pulled out the black briefcase I kept hidden against the far wall, feeling the familiar click of the latches as I opened it, and inside were the items I had gathered like pieces of armor. The printed HELOC statements showing the forged signature circled in red, the email chains where Carla coached Mark into applying the property documents proving the refinance that put the townhouse solely in my name, and a small USB drive containing audio clips from conversations where Mark admitted to using our joint account for Tessa without permission. I laid each item out carefully, checking dates and signatures, ensuring nothing was smudged or bent, because tomorrow they wanted a public spectacle. They wanted witnesses. They wanted an audience, and I would give them all of it, but not in the way they imagined, because I was not preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to reveal them, and as I closed the briefcase with a final click, I felt a calm certainty wash over me, the kind that comes when a woman who has been underestimated too long finally sees an opening to reclaim everything they tried to strip from her, not with aggression or chaos, but with truth, precision, and timing. Thanksgiving arrived beneath a pale gray Seattle sky, the kind that made the air feel dense and expectant. And as I moved through the kitchen early that morning preparing the dishes I had volunteered for weeks ago, I felt an almost surreal detachment settle over me, as if I were watching myself from a distance, calmly chopping vegetables, basting the turkey, checking timers, all while knowing exactly how the day would unfold, because I had already heard the script the night before from the bottom of the staircase, and every movement I made carried the weight of someone who knew she was stepping into a performance staged against her, but had already rewritten her role. The kitchen filled with the warm smells of rosemary, citrus, and butter scents that should have carried comfort, but instead were layered with the constant sharp commentary coming from Carla, who wandered in and out of the room with her habitual critique ready on her tongue, glancing at the turkey and saying too bland, tasting the stuffing and saying too dry, sniffing at the gravy and saying too heavy, dismissing everything with a casual wave as if her approval were something I needed to earn rather than something I no longer cared to receive, and each comment slid off me, not because it no longer stung, but because the sting had been replaced by something stronger than hurt. Tessa drifted through the kitchen once not to help, not to offer a hand or a kind word, but to take a picture of the table setting for her social media, angling the camera to frame the golden lights just right, while murmuring about aesthetic fall vibes before disappearing again into the living room where she stretched across the couch, scrolling through her phone, her sense of entitlement floating around her like perfume sweet to her, but suffocating to everyone else. By the time the relatives arrived, the house was loud with conversation, laughter, and the scraping of chairs on the hardwood floor as everyone settled around the long dining table. A table I had polished the night before, while Mark watched television, and as I took my seat, I felt the familiar shift in the air, the way the attention of a crowd subtly turns toward the woman they expect to question, evaluate, and measure. The interrogation began quickly, one aunt leaning forward and asking when we planned to give Mark a baby, another shaking her head with performative pity, saying, "Women like you regret choosing career over kids," another insisting that a woman who works too much misses the point of marriage, and I kept my face calm, even as my mind flicked through the truth I would never give them that the reason I protected my savings so fiercely was because I could not imagine raising a child in a house where financial betrayal was considered normal, that the $280,000 they saw as excessive was actually my future security, my safety net, my escape route if life backed me into a corner. As the questions continued and the conversation shifted toward money in that subtle but intrusive way families do when they believe they are entitled to an opinion about someone else's choices, a new voice joined the room. A low, steady voice belonging to a man I had not seen before, introduced by Carla as a family friend named Gary, a middle-aged man with calm eyes who listened closely to conversations that revolved around finances, his gaze following every mention of costs, benefits, savings, and obligations, as though he were cataloging details rather than making small talk. And while the others laughed lightly at his dry jokes, I sensed something in his posture that did not fit the story Carla presented. He asked a few polite questions, but did not inject himself into the conversation content to let the family's dynamic reveal itself. And every so often I would notice him glance toward me, not critically, not judgmentally, but with the measured attention of someone trying to understand the full picture. And although I did not yet know exactly who he was, the quiet observance in his eyes made me feel as though he understood far more than he let on. As the meal progressed, Carla's tone shifted from performative hosting to thinly veiled pride, the way a person begins to glow just before showing off something they have been waiting to reveal. And when one cousin complimented the food, she laughed, gestured toward me, and said, "Lily handles the heavy work. If she finally does the right thing with her money, we will be set," a statement delivered with such confidence that even I paused because she said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if my financial decisions were merely a cog in her larger plan. At that moment, Gary looked at her sharply, his expression tightening with subtle interest as he leaned forward slightly and asked, "So, you are expecting a big transfer soon?" The question cutting through the surface of the conversation with surgical precision, and the entire table stilled for a moment as Carla attempted a breezy laugh, waving her hand as though the subject were too trivial to delve into. But the flicker of unease in her eyes betrayed her. I caught Gary's glance, then steady and deliberate, a glance that told me he was not the family friend she claimed, and suddenly the puzzle pieces rearranged themselves in my mind. The attentive listening, the way he honed in on financial details, the knowledge I already had about Carla's questionable loan application, and I understood with startling clarity that Gary was not here for the cranberry sauce or turkey. He was here because he was connected to the bank, likely a loan officer or collection specialist, someone whose job it was to assess patterns, to detect inconsistencies, to piece together stories built on shaky foundations, and without meaning to Carla, had seated the very person capable of unraveling her behind her own Thanksgiving centerpiece. That realization sat between us like an unlit fuse, waiting for the right moment to ignite, and as I folded my napkin in my lap, I felt the first swell of power in my chest quiet and controlled, because not only did I have my own evidence ready for the confrontation they had planned, but now there was an unexpected witness at the table, a witness with professional credibility and access to the systems they thought they had manipulated without consequence. And it occurred to me that this was not just poetic timing, it was the final weight tipping the scale in my favor. Carla's favorite way to seize a room has always been the sound of glass being tapped, and on that Thanksgiving night she rose at the head of our long table spoon against wine glass, the ring cutting through the chatter until only the rustle of sleeves and the low hum of the heater remained 16 pairs of eyes turning toward her as if she were on a stage instead of about to turn my savings into a test. "Thank you all for coming," she began, voice smooth. "We are family, and family helps each other," and she let the words drift while people nodded and reached for their glasses. Then her tone dipped from warm to heavy. "Some people at this table have more than they need, while others are struggling to get a fair start." The aunts murmured. The uncles cleared their throats. Tessa lowered her lashes in a practiced show of humility, and I sat still with my hands in my lap, pretending this was the first time I had heard it. It is time for the blessings in this family to be shared. Carla said, her gaze sliding toward me like a slow spotlight. Time for certain people to do the right thing, because what is money if not a tool to help those you love? And the phrase "those you love" landed with a sting, not because it was false, but because she meant love as obligation. Then she delivered the line she had built the whole evening around Lily's $280,000 in savings belongs to my daughter, now clear and firm, as if she were announcing dessert, instead of declaring that my years of work had been reassigned by vote. And a few people clapped an uneven sound as they checked one another's faces to be sure this was the response expected. I felt their eyes on me like heat, weighing whether I would be generous or selfish, soft or hard, whether I would play the role they had, written the grateful young wife who proves she is part of the clan by giving up not just time and energy, but security. And I could almost hear the labels waiting if I refused, yet under all of it, my heartbeat stayed slow, because I knew this was not my trial, it was theirs. Carla turned to the sideboard and lifted a thin stack of papers, holding it up so everyone could see the bold title, Family Agreement. And she explained that they had put together a simple document so the whole room could witness the love in this moment. Her voice softening on the word love, as if signing away another person's savings in front of an audience were an act of virtue. She handed the pages to Mark first, and he did not hesitate, laid them in front of him, reached for a pen, then slid the stack toward me until it bumped the edge of my plate, a small, dull tap that felt louder than Carla's spoon on glass. "Come on, Lil," he said, somewhere between coaxing and warning sign. "It do not embarrass me in front of everyone," and that sentence showed what mattered most to him. Not my trust or safety or the truth, but the picture of himself as the good son and generous brother, the man whose wife could be counted on to pay. The room fell into that special kind of silence that gathers when a choice is about to be made, and I could feel judgment settling over the table, the expectation that I would cry or argue or beg, that I would either crumble or explode, either of which would give them a story to tell about me. Instead, I let the pause stretch, tracing the rim of my glass, watching Mark from the corner of my eye, the tight line of his jaw, the vein at his temple, the way his hand clenched around the pen, as if he might push it into my fingers if I waited too long. When I finally spoke, I did not look at Carla. I kept my eyes on my husband and asked almost lightly, "Are you sure you want everyone involved in my finances?" Mark and his eyes flickered for a second, because the question carried more weight than my tone, a signal that there were parts of this story he did not want spread across the tablecloth. Carla scoffed and cut in before he could answer, saying sometimes the family has to tell you what is best for you, and several heads bobbed in agreement, people who had no idea what sat in the black briefcase against the wall or what documents waited in my desk at work. People who only knew the script that an older woman using the language of sacrifice must be right. "You wanted this to be public," I said, my voice. Even you wanted everyone to know about my savings, about what I have, about what you think I owe. And I saw some of the faces around the table tighten, a flicker of unease crossing them as the word "owe" settled into the room, as if they were just realizing that what they were watching was not generosity being offered, but generosity being demanded. Then I let my gaze move from Mark to the rest of the table and felt the room lean in, and I said, "That account you are all talking about. Maybe you should ask Mark what he already did with it." And in that instant, the energy snapped, like a rope pulled too tight. Every head that had been turned toward me swung instead toward him, and the man who had been so confident pushing that stack of papers across the table suddenly looked small under the weight of many eyes, his mouth opening and closing without a sound as the color drained from his face, and I was no longer the one on trial. The moment the room shifted from tense anticipation to stunned silence happened so quickly it felt like the air thickened, every breath turning heavy, as all eyes stayed locked on Mark, while he stammered, his lips moving without forming anything coherent. And I let the pause linger until the discomfort spread across the table like a slow current. Then I reached calmly into my bag and pulled out the manila envelope I had placed there hours earlier, sliding it onto the table with deliberate quiet that somehow felt louder than Carla's glass tapping. And when I opened the flap and drew out the neatly printed documents, a hush fell so complete it seemed to press against my skin. "Since we are having a family meeting about my money," I said, with the same tone she had used earlier, "let us show all the numbers," and before anyone could protest, I stood up, carried my laptop to the small console table near the television, and connected it with the ease of someone who already knew exactly which cable belonged where. And a moment later, the TV lit up with the first page of the HELOC agreement, the forged version of my name circled in red, the highlight glowing against the screen like a warning siren. Carla's face twisted. First confusion flickering into panic, and she shot to her feet, shouting, "Turn that off, this is private." Her voice shrill enough to rattle the silverware, but I did not look at her. I simply clicked to the next page, showing the wire transfer trail, the funds that were supposedly approved for home improvements, but instead routed directly into two accounts, one marked under her name and one under Tessa's, and the gasp from the uncle at the far end of the table was sharp enough to break the stillness. "You made my savings public," I said quietly. "I am just returning the favor." And that line pierced through the chaos, attempting to build around us, because for once the logic they used so easily against me mirrored back at them with perfect clarity, and several relatives exchanged uneasy glances as if suddenly realizing they had stepped into something far larger than a family dispute. Mark surged forward with a burst of indignation that rang hollow even before he spoke, yelling, "It is our house, our credit, our loan," as if those words could overwhelm the fact printed plainly on the screen. But I turned to him with a calm steadiness that seemed to deflate his anger mid-sentence and said, "Correction, it is my house, my credit, and my name. The bank will pursue if I do not report this fraud," each word measured enough to slice through his bluster. The room shifted again, the tension swelling as people processed that this was not about generosity or obligation, but about forged documents, stolen funds, and legal consequences. And that shift grew sharper when Gary at the far end of the table cleared his throat, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a small identification card, which he placed gently on the table before saying, "I should probably introduce myself properly." The entire table turned toward him as he stood smoothing his shirt with a practice motion and said, "I am Gary Whitman, loan officer and collection specialist with Northwest Federal, the department that processed both the PPP loan for Carla's Wellness Boutique and this HELOC application." And Carla's knees visibly buckled as she sank back into her chair, the color draining from her face as fast as the room's confidence drained from her plan. "I have actually been trying to reach you, Carla," he continued, his voice measured but carrying the weight of authority. There are some serious questions about your paperwork. Questions we have been reviewing quietly, but which now seem connected to additional irregularities, and the phrase additional irregularities hung in the air like a hammer, waiting to fall. A murmur rose around the table, people shifting uncomfortably as they realized the woman who spent years preaching about being the moral center of the family was suddenly being addressed like a defendant. And even Tessa, who had been lounging confidently minutes earlier, now shrank into her seat, scrolling her phone with trembling fingers as if searching for an escape route. I advanced to the next slide displaying the dealership invoice for her $16,000 down payment and the string of withdrawals totaling thousands over the months, and the room once again turned to Mark, who looked trapped between anger and fear, his face pale beneath the dining room lights. Before he could muster another excuse, Gary spoke again, directing his attention toward me this time, saying in a steady tone, "If she chooses to report this as identity theft and fraud, the bank will prioritize protecting her." And the way he emphasized protecting her sent a ripple through the room, a realization settling like dust on every surface that I was not the vulnerable one in this equation. They were. The message was unmistakable. If I pressed forward, if I filed the report, if I let the investigation run its course, both Carla and Mark could face consequences that went far beyond embarrassment, because financial fraud was not something a family vote could erase. And in that moment, the authority they believed they held over me evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable truth that the only person in that room with real power was the quiet woman they had spent years underestimating. I paused on the final slide, the one listing each unauthorized transfer in simple numbers, letting the weight of it settle before I closed the laptop and returned to my seat. And in the silence that followed, even the sound of someone swallowing felt loud, because everyone understood what had just happened. The public exposure they intended for me had become the public exposure of their own deceit, and there was no script left for them to hide behind. I let the last image on the television fade to black before I closed the laptop with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any shouting could have been. Then I looked around the table and said in a steady voice that carried through the room, "Without needing to rise, I will be filing a fraud complaint with the bank immediately, and I will be contacting both the fraud department and my attorney tonight, because I will not be responsible for a loan created with a forged version of my name." And as soon as the words left my mouth, a wave of panic rippled across the table. Carla lurched forward as if the chair had burned her, pointing a trembling finger at me and yelling, "You cannot do this to us," her voice cracking under the weight of her own choices. But I did not flinch as I replied, "You already did this to me." The sentence landing in the center of the room like a dropped stone. I reached into the manila envelope again this time, pulling out a slim folder, clipped neatly. The refinance documents I had signed 3 months earlier, the ones showing the townhouse in my name alone after Mark had voluntarily removed himself from the title to protect himself from his own bad credit and unpaid debts. And when I laid the papers on the table, the silence grew even thicker, because they all finally understood that the house they believed they ruled from did not belong to them at all. I slid the top page toward Mark and said, "This house is legally mine. You forged my name to borrow against it, and you do not get to keep both." And the shock on his face spread like a slow bloom of realization as he read the line showing his signature, resigning his claim to the property, his hands beginning to shake as if the paper itself were vibrating. Then I straightened up, looking from him to Carla, and said clearly, "Mark and Carla will have 30 days to move out during that time. I will not be living here. I will be sending formal notice through my attorney, and I will not be discussing this any further." And the murmurs around the table rose into a stunned buzz as family members exchanged glances, unsure whether to comfort them or stay far away from the wreckage. I turned from the table without waiting for objections, walking toward the stairs as the room erupted into a mess of pleading voices and frantic whispers. But the noise felt distant, fading behind me as I climbed each step with a calm that came from certainty rather than rage. And when I reached the bedroom, I pulled the small suitcase from the corner, the one I had quietly packed the night before, when I understood exactly how the next 24 hours would unfold. I zipped it closed, lifted it with one hand, and felt an unexpected lightness settle across my chest, as if shedding years of weight I had carried without realizing it. Then walked back down the hallway toward the staircase, hearing the chaotic sound of Carla trying to convince distant relatives that this was a misunderstanding, while Mark repeated weak denials that no one believed anymore. As I re-entered the dining room, people shifted aside, instinctively creating a pathway, and the looks they gave me were different now, a mix of respect and fear and something else. The dawning recognition that the quiet woman they had dismissed had just dismantled the entire structure of entitlement they had built around her. I paused at the doorway, resting my hand lightly on the frame, as if giving them one last chance to understand what they had thrown away, then turned back toward the table, where the refinance papers still lay open, and said, "By the way, the $280,000 you thought you were dividing up is just one account. You never even asked what the rest looks like." And the way Carla's mouth fell open without producing a single word was more satisfying than anything I could have planned. A few relatives inhaled sharply, as if the floor had tilted beneath them, realizing that I had never been the desperate one in this dynamic, and the looks on their faces told me they finally understood that everything they had tried to take from me was only a small fraction of what I actually had, a truth they would never have known had they not pushed so far past the line that I had no reason to protect their pride anymore. Mark took a step toward me, reaching out with a desperate, half-formed "please wait." But I lifted the suitcase slightly, as if drawing a boundary he could no longer cross, and he froze because for the first time he saw I was not bluffing, not threatening, not negotiating. I was done. I turned away once more, the soft click of my heels on the wood floor echoing through the quieted room, and as I opened the front door, a gust of cold evening air rushed in, carrying with it a sense of freedom so sharp it felt almost physical. Then I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door with a calm, deliberate motion, an ending as quiet as it was absolute, leaving them all behind in the thick, stunned silence they had earned. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the universe itself had taken a long breath, while everything that had been hidden began rising to the surface, because by Monday morning, the bank had already opened a formal investigation into the forged HELOC and the internal fraud team. The same group I worked alongside in a different branch flagged the account as high risk, immediately freezing access and placing every transaction under review, which meant Carla could no longer touch the funds she and Mark had siphoned together, and within 48 hours, she received a letter printed on firm white stock, informing her that the loan was under audit due to signature irregularities, a phrase that might sound mild on paper, but in the banking world is as ominous as a storm warning siren. I pictured her opening that envelope at her kitchen table, the same table where she once told me I should be grateful to be part of their family. Only now, the institution she tried to exploit was turning its full scrutiny on her. And the thought did not bring me joy exactly, but it did bring a sense of balance, a feeling that the scales she had bent so confidently were finally tilting back. By midweek, a second letter arrived from the Office of the Attorney General requesting clarification on discrepancies tied to the PPP loan Carla had applied for years ago, and I imagined her face draining of color as she read the words, "potential civil liability," because people like her always believed consequences were for others, never for themselves. Tessa's unraveling happened even faster because the dealership she had proudly posed in front of with her new car posted a repossession notice after months of missed payments, and without my money, and without Mark funneling cash from the joint account, she no longer had a safety net, So when the tow truck hauled the car from the driveway, someone recorded it, and a cousin's teenage son uploaded it to social media, where it was immediately stitched with a clip from Thanksgiving, showing Tessa smirking at me across the table, creating a humiliating before and after that, spread through their local circles like wildfire, and by the end of the week she had blocked half the people she once bragged to. Mark's collapse came in layers, each one sliding out from under him like loose floorboards, because when he tried applying for an apartment on his own, his credit score was so damaged by unpaid balances and inquiries that every complex turned him away. And when someone in his workplace quietly mentioned that he might be facing legal scrutiny because of a fraud investigation, he was connected to his manager, asked him to take indefinite leave, a polite way of saying he was done. And I knew he would try to blame me for all of it, but deep down he must have realized he had built his life on sand long before I walked out the door. Meanwhile, I moved into a small sublet in Capitol Hill belonging to a coworker who had taken an extended overseas assignment, and the space was simple, quiet, and filled with light, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had lived for months inside the townhouse. And each morning I woke without the weight of someone else's expectations, pressing against my ribs, breathing easier than I had in years. At work, I kept my focus tight, refusing to let personal chaos bleed into my professionalism. And when my manager called me into her office, she told me she did not need all the details, but she respected the way I had navigated something clearly difficult while maintaining clarity and integrity in my role. Her tone carrying the kind of quiet approval that mattered far more than the validation I used to chase from people who never intended to give it. Then came the twist I could never have predicted, yet somehow felt perfectly aligned with the path that had opened, because the regional headquarters in Portland reached out through my department, head offering me a promotion into a senior leadership role within fraud analytics, a position that would give me greater authority, higher salary, broader impact, and far more distance from the suburb of Renton, where I had tried so hard to build a life that turned out to be nothing but illusion. And as I sat in the small sublet reading the offer letter on my laptop screen, I felt a slow warmth spread through my chest, a confirmation that stepping away from that dinner table had not been an ending, but the beginning of a new chapter that belonged solely to me. I thought about how many times I had told myself to wait a little longer for things to improve, how many moments I had excused, justified, softened. But now I finally understood what leaving had given me. Not just freedom from them, but freedom to grow into the version of myself that had been quietly waiting behind all that fear and politeness. And as I accepted the offer, typing my signature in the digital box, I felt the final thread to that old life loosen and fall away, making room for everything that would come next. 2.5 months passed before the first call came through a number I did not recognize, lighting up my screen while I was standing in the kitchen of my temporary Capitol Hill apartment, stirring a pot of soup on a quiet Sunday evening, and when I let it ring out, the voicemail that followed carried Carla's strained voice trembling between anger and desperation as she said, "We are losing the house. If you do not drop the fraud claim," followed by a sharp inhale and a forced appeal to family, insisting that no matter what happened, we are still connected, and surely I did not want to see them homeless. Her tone swinging wildly between guilt and entitlement, as if she had forgotten that she had once stood in my dining room announcing that my life savings belonged to her daughter. The next day, a text came from an unknown number that I immediately recognized as Tessa's new phone. The message a clumsy attempt at sympathy that read, "We all make mistakes, and we need your help right now," followed a few hours later by Mark's message saying, "Lily, please call me. We can fix this." And for the first time since walking out of that house, I felt nothing. No tug, no guilt, no familiar softening, just a steady clarity that told me all of this had been inevitable the moment I stopped absorbing the blows they were used to throwing. I agreed to meet them once, not because I owed them anything, but because closure required a clear line drawn in daylight. So we chose a public cafe in downtown Seattle, where the clatter of cups and soft hum of conversation would keep the meeting grounded. And when I walked in, carrying only my small purse, I saw Carla and Mark already seated, both looking smaller than I remembered, their confidence stripped away. What neither of them expected was that I came with company because Gary, the loan officer, was already there at the table with my attorney seated beside him, and the way Carla's face blanched when she recognized him told me she had hoped this meeting would be a private plea rather than a formal reckoning. I sat across from them and set my hands calmly on the table while Carla immediately leaned forward with red-rimmed eyes, saying, "You overreacted. It was just a piece of paper, and you ruined Thanksgiving. You ruined our lives." Her voice trembling with the dramatic self-pity. People like her retreat into when consequences arrive. But I held her gaze without blinking as I replied, "You tried to steal my future to fund your daughter's lifestyle. I just refused to play." And the words settled between us like a closing door. Mark attempted to speak next, stumbling through an apology that dissolved into excuses, but Gary lifted a hand gently and took the lead, explaining that regardless of whether I withdrew my report, the bank would continue to review the forged documents because fraud at this level could not be erased by personal agreements, and the only reason the consequences had not escalated further was because I had cooperated fully and promptly, allowing the bank to focus its investigation on the individuals who actually falsified my signature. Carla's face twisted with disbelief, as if reality itself were betraying her, and she reached for my arm as she whispered, "Please do not let them do this to us." But I pulled my arm back slowly, not harshly, but firmly, reminding her she'd lost any right to reach for me long ago. Then came the moment the entire meeting hinged on the quiet twist that would finalize the boundary they never expected me to set, because I told them calmly that there was one thing I was willing to do. I would not push the case to the highest criminal level available, meaning I would not request the additional charges the bank had the right to pursue. And Carla's eyes lit up as if she believed this was the lifeline she had been waiting for. But that hope flickered out when I continued and said, "But only if you both sign an agreement drafted by my attorney, stating that you will never claim any of my assets, you will never contact me, you will never appear at my home or workplace, and you will not use my name for any financial purpose ever again." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste Mark leaning back, as if the air had been punched out of him, while Carla's mouth fell open in a stunned oval because they had expected money or mercy or negotiation. But instead, they were being handed the exact measure of distance I needed to end this permanently. I clarified that I was not offering financial support, was not forgiving the debt, was not rescuing them from the consequences they created. I was simply agreeing not to add more charges to the fire if they honored the boundaries they had violated over and over. My attorney placed the paperwork on the table, sliding it toward them, and for a long moment they stared at the 2 sheets of paper that represented the only version of help I would ever give again. Carla finally whispered, "This is cruel," and I answered softly, "It is fair." And for once, she had no reply. They signed slowly with shaking hands, and when the pens scraped the final stroke, I felt something release in my chest, like a latch, clicking open, a quiet internal shift, telling me this chapter had reached its true ending. They looked at me, waiting for some hint of comfort, some reassurance that things could still be repaired, but I simply stood, nodded to Gary and my attorney, and said, "Thank you for meeting," then walked away from the table without looking back, leaving them with the one truth they could never twist to their advantage again. I did not hate them. I simply did not need them, and that was a punishment they never saw coming. Moving to Portland felt less like relocating and more like stepping into a life I had quietly been building piece by piece without fully realizing it. And as I unlocked the door to the small condo overlooking a tree-lined street in the Northwest District, I felt a softness settle into my shoulders, a sense that this place with its still mornings and gentle light through the windows would finally allow me to breathe without bracing for the next demand or insult or crisis someone else created. And each day, I walked to the headquarters where I now served as head of fraud analytics. I felt myself easing into the authority of the role, not with the loud swagger people like Carla admired, but with the steady confidence of a woman who had learned exactly what she was capable of when she stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. My hours were flexible, my team respected me, and the work felt meaningful in a way it never fully had before, maybe because now I understood on a visceral level how devastating financial abuse could be when disguised as family loyalty, and that understanding made my judgment sharper, my empathy keener, my leadership deeper. On the weekends, I drove down to Oregon to visit the 3 hardware stores my father had built, long before I knew how hard he worked to give me the stability he never had. And each time I walked through the aisles or reviewed the books with the longtime manager who had known my dad since before I was born, I felt something like gratitude threading through me, because the 20% ownership he left me had grown steadily increasing in value each year, until my net worth now hovered somewhere between $1.4 and $1.6 million a number. No one in my former marriage had ever asked about, because they assumed my worth, both emotional and financial, began and ended with the $280,000 they tried to seize. I never flaunted that number and never would, but seeing it on my financial dashboard one quiet evening reminded me that leaving that house and everything in it had not diminished me, it had returned me to myself. In my free time, I joined a local group that supported women dealing with financial manipulation and coercion, sharing practical tools, like how to open an independent account, how to track statements, how to speak to a bank representative, how to document abusive transactions, how to find an attorney willing to do an initial consult. And though I never told my full story, I offered enough insight that women recognized the lived experience behind my calm explanations. And watching them shift from confusion to clarity gave me a sense of purpose I had never felt at any family holiday table. One afternoon, I sat across from a woman my age who whispered that she felt stupid for not seeing what her partner was doing, and I leaned in gently and said, "Intelligence has nothing to do with it. Love makes you give people the benefit of the doubt long after they stop deserving it." And saying the words out loud felt like closing another small door on the past. Eventually, I decided to take a portion of the dividend income from the hardware stores and put it towards something that would honor my father's legacy in a way he would have recognized. So I contributed $50,000 to establish a small fund in his name designed to help women leave financially abusive environments by covering the cost of emergency housing deposits and early legal help, and signing that check felt like the purest form of justice. Not revenge against the people who wronged me, but a hand extended toward people who still needed a way out. As spring arrived and Portland filled with the smell of rain-warmed pavement, I settled into a rhythm of long morning walks, focused workdays, quiet dinners, and gentle weekends, and nearly every week I found myself in the same little coffee shop near my condo where the owner knew my order without asking, and the corner table always seemed to be waiting for me. One afternoon, I sat there scanning through emails when the quarterly dividend report from the hardware stores arrived, the numbers solid and steady, and I felt a quiet smile lift the corner of my mouth, not because of the money itself, but because of the reminder of where I came from and how far I had allowed myself to grow once I stopped pouring everything I had into people who only saw me as a resource. I looked up from my screen and through the front window noticed a family at a nearby table arguing over a bill, their voices rising with frustration, and for a moment I saw a shadow of my old life, all the tension and fear and bargaining I had once mistaken for normal, and a soft wave of relief washed over me, because I was no longer sitting at a table where I had to justify my worth to people who would never value it. In that quiet moment, I thought to myself if I had signed that paper, I would still be at that Thanksgiving table, begging people who never saw me as a person. Walking out was the richest thing I ever did, and the truth of it settled warm and deep in my chest. As I closed my laptop and gathered my things, I held on to one final thought, one that had taken months to form, but now felt like a guiding star. Sometimes the most expensive thing you can give a toxic family is access. The moment you cut that off, you are richer than you ever were. And with that, I stepped out into the soft Portland light, ready for whatever came next. If this story resonates with you and someone has ever treated you like a walking wallet, leave one word below freedom